So before we start, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I also want to start by thanking Glennis Young and Nick Grail and the History Department staff for organizing this wonderful lecture series. It's always great to come here and see the packed house that this lecture series draws. It's so wonderful. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight. For thousands of years, humans have been singing songs about rivers. Right now, because I said that, you're thinking about a song about a river. I know that you are. You're thinking about songs about rivers that have mattered to you. The first one that comes to mind for me is Bruce Springsteen's The River. It's impossible not to. The song you're most likely thinking of tells a story, as most songs do, about a time, a place, some people, some aspect of the lived experience. But why rivers? Why do we sing of them, about them, and occasionally with them? Why do we study rivers and their histories? It's important to note that in addition to singing about them, we also write and tell river stories, a lot of them, of the Danube and the Mississippi, of the Ganges and the Yangtze, of the Seine and the Tiber, of the Limpopo and the Euphrates, and an uncountable number of others that have, to use a water metaphor, seeped into, permeated, and saturated cultures across the globe. We sing about rivers because they matter now, as they always have to human life. We write about rivers because their stories are our stories. So we sing and we write, but we also draw and paint and carve rivers, which have served as the representational focus for countless images, from ancient depictions carved into, drawn, and painted on rock and papyrus, to renowned paintings. Again, there are so many, but American environmental historians, and there are many of you in the audience, will most likely know of Thomas Cole's famous painting of the Connecticut River Valley titled The Oxbow, to the representation in Islamic gardens where the nearly formulaic repetition of the crossing of four channels depicts both the four rivers of paradise described in the Quran, and as scholars of those gardens have more recently surmised, the imperial ability to control a scarce and difficult to harness resource for pleasure, while simultaneously symbolizing engineering and agricultural prowess. We make river images to know them, and again to tell their stories, which are fundamentally our stories. We also aim to capture their constantly shifting beauty. Cartographers know and try to represent rivers a bit differently. Maps are intended to fix subjects in a place so they can be reliably located, but rivers resist such fixity. They ebb and flow, crest and flood, their courses change, their tracks deepen, they create great valleys and goosenecks as they meander over millennia. They vex the conventions of Western cartography, not all other forms, but we defy truth and depict the capture anyway, periodically redrawing and remapping as though the pen can pin a river's water to the earth. Rivers are the wild and the rural, the village and the city. They sustain life and they sometimes take it away. In polluted conditions, they've both carried and washed away sewage and cholera, dysentery and hepatitis. In more favorable riparian contexts, they provide myriad health benefits that we are only now beginning to fully understand. They are the transportation conduits around which cities have grown. They are the boundaries we use to divide territories. Scientists study sequences of pools and riffles to understand the habitat and change. Sports enthusiasts see them as a series of whitewater rapids and more restful eddies. Fly fishermen and women seek the deeper pools, the current breaks, the back eddies, the so-called softer water. In short, and though this may sound trite, rivers are life. They are central to nearly every religion and belief system, where they provide the locus for ritual purification, baptism, as a site for obtaining holy water, and for the immersion of deities. They serve as vital conduits for commerce, trade, and the movement of goods. They're sources of energy and power as their currents turn wheels, water wheels, and their falls provide electricity. We use them to create boundaries and borders that delineate here from there, us from them, mine from yours. They are richly complex ecological systems that, when healthy, can sustain astonishingly varied life forms and entire communities. For the Coast Salish people whose lands we currently occupy, rivers remain animate, central to entire watershed ecologies and communities and diverse food economies based on fish, shellfish, birds, and mammals, along with carbohydrate-dense roots and berries. It seems that humans have always been drawn to manipulating rivers, moving and fortifying their banks, building dams and sluiceways, enclosing them in concrete and underground culverts, diverting their waters for irrigation and power, extracting food, minerals, and metals. Such efforts sit at the center of what the historian Carl Wittfogel called hydraulic societies, a long contested concept that situates control of water as sitting at the heart of despotic regimes, perhaps especially so where water is scarce or in unpredictable supply, which now could be true of most of our planet. As the writer Joan Didion once wrote, water is important to people who do not have it, and the same is true of control. These things are the same. The word confluence is also important here. It names the junction of two rivers and evokes the many ways rivers bring people and things together, and in ways that have been positive and negative, but are nearly always complex, fascinating, and inherently dynamic. We'll hear about the many of these things, I suspect, in the lectures that lie ahead in this series. The poet Robert Haas wrote this about rivers. Though the names are still magic, Amazon, Congo, Mississippi, Niger, Platte, Volga, Tiber, Seine, Ganges, Mekong, Rhine, Colorado, Marne, Orinoco, Rio Grande, the rivers themselves have almost disappeared from consciousness in the modern world. Insofar as they exist in our imaginations, that existence is nostalgic. Rivers and the river gods that defined our civilizations have become the sublimated symbols of everything we have done to the planet in the last 200 years. And the rivers themselves have come to function as trace memories of what we have repressed in the name of our technical mastery. They are the ecological unconscious. So of course, they show up in poetry. Under various names, wrote Czesław Miłosz, who grew up in Lithuania along the Nieman, I have praised only you, rivers. You are milk and honey and love and death and dance. I take this to be the first stirrings, even as our civilization did its damning and polluting of the recognition of what we have lost and need to recover. In tonight's lecture and in those to come in the weeks ahead, we'll listen to outstanding historians from our University of Washington History Department as they help us understand four river lives: the Nile, the Ganges, the Rio Grande, and much closer to home, the Columbia. They'll help us know and understand what we have lost and what we need to recover. There's perhaps now more than ever much to recover. I look forward to all they will share with us, and thank you so much for joining us for this important series.
Greetings. What a wonderful full house, and what an honor it is to stand here before you. Thank you, Dean Harris, for the very, very thoughtful remarks. Good evening to you all, including those who will watch this afterwards, because we're going to put it on video as well. It's one of the real honors of my career here at the university to open this 50th anniversary of this series. I've taught at the University of Washington since 1997. I don't like to count how many years that is. It's few. And I've learned so much from my colleagues, both within and beyond the University of History, Department of History, students, access students, staff. And I'll try to share a little bit of that knowledge with you tonight. I want to begin with a short American poem. I didn't know Dean Harris was going to talk about poetry, but I'm going to add to that conversation just briefly. In the summer of 1920, recent high school graduate Langston Hughes traveled from his home in Cleveland, Ohio, to visit his father in Mexico City. His route took him across the lower Mississippi River, and as he was crossing that river, Hughes, just 18 years old, composed the first draft of what would become one of his most admired works. Published the following year, his poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, is a powerful meditation on race, history, and identity. In 100 words, Hughes uses the theme of rivers to explore and embrace his identity as a black man in America and as a member of the ancient human race. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood and human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised pyramids above. I heard the singing in the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. Hughes' poem presents 4 rivers as symbols of different strands of his ancestry. The Nile and the Euphrates, both biblical rivers, stand for the earliest history of humanity, a time when dawns were young and when yet mankind raised mighty pyramids. The Congo represents an idyllic homeland deep in Africa, a place where the river soothed like a mother. The Mississippi embodies the contradiction at the heart of American history. The same muddy stream on which Hughes' ancestors were sold downriver to the vast slave market of New Orleans also conveyed young Abraham Lincoln, the future agent of emancipation. The Langston Hughes Memorial in the lobby of the Schomburg Center in New York places these 4 rivers at the heart of an installation that integrates quotations from the poem. The memorial's creator, Houston Conwell, extends the river metaphor by having the ancient dusky rivers of Hughes's design flow into a further series of global rivers which line the edges of the lobby, the Volga, the Amazon, the Ganges, and so forth. This design underscores the centrality of rivers for understanding the interconnected nature of our world. This lecture series will focus on the history of 4 rivers, but as my colleagues and I speak about these rivers, I invite you to think about other rivers that you've crossed, floated down, or even dreamed of seeing. Think about the fundamental place of rivers, the way they've always held in the history of our species, as vital sources of fresh water, as sources of kinetic energy, as arteries of travel and communication, as boundaries, difficult to cross but still permeable, as the home of essential aquatic plants and animals, sometimes magical and marvelous ones, and as earthly markers of spiritual or divine truths, and finally, not least, as barometers of climate change. Now, this evening, I invite you to consider just one of these ancient dusky rivers that have shaped our world history. Our focus is on the Nile and ancient Egypt. And that means we're exploring not the whole river, nor the whole history, but just the most famous and best documented phase of one of the most famous rivers in history. And we'll be focusing on the region of the Nile, roughly equivalent with its boundaries in the modern country of Egypt. Yet even this partial history of the Nile requires us to adjust our sense of scale. In America, we often think of history as unfolding a decade at a time. 1960s, 1980s, maybe a presidential administration at a time, the Kennedy era, the Reagan era. The history of ancient Egypt extends across 3,500 years. That's the history of recorded ancient Egyptian history. Egyptian dynastic history begins around 3100 BC, right here on the far left of your slide, when the first pharaohs based in Upper Egypt conquered the delta and united the Egyptian segment of the Nile Valley under the power of a single ruler. This political system of pharaonic rule evolved over time, but it maintained its core features all the way down to the 33 dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty, whose last ruler you may have heard of, Cleopatra VII, who was then defeated in 31 BC by Octavian, who then oversees the integration of Egypt into the Roman Empire. Modern Egyptologists organize this vast period of time into this landscape of pharaonic political history into three major chronological eras. And I introduce this now because I'm going to draw upon evidence from all of them in my lecture tonight. Well, not only the early dynastic period, but the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and even we'll take some material from the late period in the Ptolemaic era, the Hellenistic era. And of course, Egyptian civilization culture doesn't disappear in between these kingdoms. These are just periods of relatively low centralized political control, so they get known as intermediate periods between the dynasties. Now, the durability of Egypt's political system hinged on both cultural and environmental factors. The hieroglyphic writing system, invented in the early dynastic period around 3100 BC, it's the second oldest writing system in the world, endured into the Roman period in both cursive and monumental forms. With a continuous literary history extending across 3.5 millennium, Egyptian is truly one of the great languages of the ancient world. And I'm glad my colleague Scott Nagel teaches it here at the University of Washington. I hope it'll continue to be taught for many years ahead. I plan to discuss tonight 4 aspects of ancient Egypt's relationship with the Nile, or as the Egyptians called it, simply the river, Iteru. First, we need to understand the Nile's seasonal rhythm, the annual progression of inundation, emergence, and drought that watered the land's flocks and fields and created the distinction between the black land and the red land, the black land being the Nile Valley itself, and the red land, the surrounding deserts. Second, I'll explain why the Nile River possessed this rhythm, an inquiry that will involve thinking about the entire river in its East African context, not just its Egyptian section, along with the story of its principal tributaries, the Blue and the White Nile, and the rapids known as the cataracts, which served as partially permeable buffers between ancient Egypt and its neighbors to the south. Third, we'll discuss the Nile's role in travel and transport. This will also take us into the realm of boat symbolism, about which we could say a great deal, and the symbolic conveyance of corpses by boat across the river, across the Nile, into the burial grounds on its western bank. And the gods also, as we'll see, traveled by boat, not only across the Nile, but even in their journeys across the heaven. And fourth and finally, we'll see how the animals that lived along the Nile became part of the Egyptians' diet and recreation, but also part of their religious imagination. Now, it's well known that ancient Egypt was, in the words of the Greek historian Herodotus, the gift of the Nile. Tonight's lecture will try to show you precisely how and why the culture of ancient Egypt was dependent on the Nile, and it also seeks to illuminate some of the ways in which the Nile was, to quote the common phrase used in my title, a river of the gods. And I'll suggest it's a river of the gods, which is not the same thing as saying it's a holy river. It's a river imbued with the power of divinity, but not viewed as essentially holy in the same way as, say, the Ganges. And as an epilogue to tonight, originally part of my outline, as you can see, but I moved it into the Q&A to make sure we had enough time. We might think a little bit about how the patterns of the sacrality of the Nile, the rhythms I'm explaining in the lecture tonight, how they were processed after the collapse of, or how they evolved after the collapse of pharaonic political power. So, okay, we got a plan? Good? Let's go. All right, part 1, the seasons of the Nile. Nearly every summer in Egypt until the 20th century, the Nile River followed a vital, predictable pattern. Around mid-June, the river's waters began to rise, overflowing its banks and gradually flooding the fields on both the eastern and western sides. Ancient Egyptians greeted this inundation with hymns of joy. The priest also carefully and anxiously measured its progress, using tools called nilometers to register the flood's progress. And the nilometer at Elephantine, at the first cataract, was especially important because this is where the first Nile surge of the flood began to enter ancient Egypt. And this is one of 3 types of nilometers. There were also some that were organized around pillars or in a well, but this is the step design where as the water ascends, they measured it against the scale set on the steps. If the waters if the waters came too quickly, they could destroy crops before the harvest. More common, more dangerous though, was with the years when the water did not rise enough, leaving the upper fields parched and potentially triggering famine. And good years, and fortunately for the Egyptians, most years were good, very good years. The inundation crested around 16 cubits. It's about 8 meters above the banks. It's quite a rise for a river, completely submerging the adjacent fields during the hottest months of the year and allowing them to regenerate. The inundation was such a blessing that the Egyptians personified him as a deity. Hapi, not happy, but same concept. An androgynous god depicted with the headdress and beard of a pharaoh and the swollen belly and breast of a pregnant woman. And this is from a 10th century BC sculpture. You can kind of see his full belly here in the distance. In some images, he wears a wreath of aquatic plants, and a popular hymn composed in the Middle Kingdom exalts Hapi as the one who, quote, floods the fields when the fields that the sun god Ra has made to nourish all who thirst. Now in the autumn, usually around the middle of October, the floodwaters that crested over the Nile's riverbed began to recede. This marked the beginning of the second season, the season the Egyptians knew as Peret, or the emergence. Critically, the slow rate of the river's retraction allowed nutrient-rich sediment floating in the muddy water to drop and seep into the soil. The gradual pace of the emergence also gave Egyptian peasants the time to build canals and ponds to guide the water to their fields. Counterweight lifting devices known as shadoufs, introduced in the New Kingdom and used in rural Egypt until recent times, although there were technological developments in the Persian and Roman period. The shadoufs help farmers make maximum use of the river water for irrigation during the period of the emergence. While the soil was still damp, it was time to plow. Plant seeds, often with the aids of teams of yoked oxen, like the ones depicted here in this wooden tomb sculpture from the Middle Kingdom. And I love this detail. I haven't checked this with an art historian, but I'm assuming the reason these guys don't have feet are not depicted with feet is because they're standing in the mud, right? You have to plow when the ground is still damp. So they're standing ankle deep in mud, pulling guiding the plow behind the oxen, and then planting the seeds as the land is emerging from the inundation. The Nile's third season, known as Shimu, or drought, began in mid-March. This was the time of the harvest and the tax collector, unfortunately. The family tomb of the 18th dynasty official named Minna depicts the harvest from an elite perspective. Minna, he's not visible in this photo. He's seated, you have to imagine he's seated right here, just off the screen, and he's watching this scene in which the scribes come and count the grain. You can see it being scooped up here. Another scribe is sitting here on top of the pile of grain. This is a chest holding scribal tools, whole series of further scribes here. And this is Minna, again, depicted in the back, along with his hieroglyphic title. Thank you, Scott Nagel, for reading that for me. He's listed here as Minna, what did this say here? Minna, the scribe of the Lord of the Two Lands. So this is the harvest according to elites, what should happen, make sure that everything is properly counted and measured. Now after the harvest, the fields dried out, the earth cracked open, aerating the soil, and then around mid-June, the silty waters of the Nile began to rise again, soaking the parched soil and bringing new nitrogen-rich sediment and renewing the whole cycle. Now this steady, dependable, seasonal rhythm made the Nile River Valley one of the most productive agrarian zones of the entire pre-modern world. It created a strip of highly fertile land, extending about 6 kilometers on either side of the river. The cycle created a contrast between what the Egyptians knew as the Black Land, or Kemet, which is the place of villages, of towns, of fields, of temples, And black refers to the quality of the soil. It's green here because black soil produces good crops. And they contrasted this with the land of the desert, the Desheret, which they associated it was the land of the dead, the land of uncivilized nomads, of dangerous beasts like the jackal. Now, so stark is this contrast. You see it here in a photo. Thank you to my friend Brad who took this photo from the Valley of the Kings. But this conceptual contrast between the black land and red land in Egyptian thought reflects that real environmental contrast created between the fertile soil of the Nile Valley itself and the dry, arid land on both the eastern and western desert. And so sharp is that divide, it's clearly visible from space. You can see the river winding its way north to the Mediterranean, beyond the Fayum region, and into the delta where it branches out and enters into the Mediterranean. I remember the first time I ever saw these photos, I just took my breath away. All right, so why did the Nile behave this way? Why did it have this distinctive pattern that made Egypt such an extraordinarily rich agrarian zone? This is a question that had already intrigued ancient authors, and they offered a variety of explanations, some of them quite fanciful, others closer to the point. Herodotus already says that maybe it's the rains in Ethiopia. Some people believe it's the rains in Ethiopia, but they're wrong. Well, yeah, well, let's see about that. And in order to see about that, we have to shift our attention into part 2 of my lecture now to think about the larger Nile River basin, not just the Egyptian segment of it. So we have to think about the hydrology of the Nile. Africa's longest river, the Nile, extends more than 6,600 kilometers from its origins in the highlands of East Africa to the Mediterranean. It's a young river in geological terms. It only acquired its current shape maybe 80,000 years ago. It flows from the south to the north. So when the Egyptians first encountered a river that flowed north to south like the Euphrates, they called it the upside down river. But somehow, to our minds, you have to kind of adjust your vision to recognize, to see that orientation of the Egyptian river flowing from south to north. Both of its major tributaries, the Blue and the White Nile, and I'm going to flip the map here 90 degrees to give you a different perspective on the Blue and White Nile. Both of those tributaries are significantly longer than the river's Egyptian segment. The Blue Nile, which originates in Lake Tana in northern Ethiopia, is the more powerful of the two. And I think all you need to do is to look at this picture of the Abe with the falls here to recognize that power. Fed by the rains of the Indian Ocean monsoon, as some people in the age of Herodotus correctly posited, the waters of the Blue Nile provide 60% of the river's volume during most of the year, closer to 80% during the season of the inundation. And Ethiopians, modern Ethiopians, are justly proud of their river, which they call the Abe. The contemporary Ethiopian pop singer Gigi, for instance, celebrates the river as, quote, water that flows from paradise since the conception of Adam, majestic, splendid, the nation's dress, the nation's grace, Abe, 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 nourishment for the desert. Thanks to my colleague Mahari for translating these evocative words. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, begun in 2011, seeks to capture the river's power for electricity generation and irrigation. This is why you get songs like this, which are very nationalistic and celebrating the river as well. I'd be happy to talk about that topic in the Q&A, but it's, again, the story of another Nile, different from the one that's our focus today. The White Nile takes its origins from Lake Victoria in northern Tanzania, shown here. And its northward journey is much less precipitous than that of the Blue Nile. It meanders along, and in the process, it picks up a lot of silt. It also provides prime grazing territory for the Nuer, the Dinka, other cattle herding peoples of the central Nile Basin. And the rivers meet at Khartoum, capital of modern-day Sudan, where the chalky waters of the White Nile, you can see here, all that the muddy, chalky, muddy waters of the White Nile blend, although only very gradually, with the greater flow of the Blue Nile before joining forces and flowing on further to the north. On its pathway to the Mediterranean, the Nile flows through a series of rapids known as cataracts. I don't know why they're called cataracts, but they're rapids that create a semi-permeable boundary along the Nile Valley, a north-south boundary that prevented boat travel and constrained Egyptian ambitions to extend pharaonic power into Nubia. Egyptian imperial expansion did peak into that region in the Middle Kingdom with the construction of fortresses like the one you see here, just south of the second cataract. Now, Egypt proper, as usually understood, did not begin until one passed the first cataract at Aswan. So you've come down through 6 sets of cataracts as you're coming northward or downstream. And then this is the last of the cataracts at Aswan, which includes the island of El Infantini, which you see here. The name itself is a sign of its function. That is, Aswan, the name of the town Aswan comes from an Egyptian word meaning trade center, and Elephantini refers, I believe, to the ivory deposits which were accumulated at the site by the governors of Aswan. And you see here one of those governors, Harkuf, a very famous inscription from around 2150 BC. I'm giving approximate dates here. We often have more precise dates, but just for the sake of presentation, I'll give you the round dates. Harkuf boasts of the 4 expeditions he led into Nubia, bringing back ivory, animal skins, ebony, ostrich eggs, and slaves to then be traded from Aswan, from Elephantini, on further north. Aswan's importance as a transition zone and a trading depot hinged on the change of the river that created by the last of the cataracts. An elevation chart of the entire Nile Basin clearly illustrates this point. The river descends quickly from its origins in the highlands of East Africa. You can see here the steep elevation drop that creates those waterfalls on the Blue Nile. Fairly steep drop also from Lake Victoria, and then more gently after it passed through the marsh known as the Sud. And then the 2 rivers join at Khartoum, as we've seen already, still losing elevation as it flows northwards towards the Mediterranean, passes through those series of 6 cataracts. And look what happens after the last of those cataracts. You see how gentle the slope is, how little elevation it loses in the last stretch? This means that for the last, so Aswan is only, it's at less than 200 meters above sea level. So for the last 1,000 plus 1,200 kilometers of the route with the Nile's route within modern Egypt, it has very little elevation loss. What does that do? It creates a gentle river. It creates a river that can be easily navigated. So easily navigated that the Egyptians even build it into this predictability into their writing system. The hieroglyphic sign for going upstream, well, hold on, let me show you on this one first. If you want to go downstream, you see, all you got to do is to get in your boat and go downstream. You don't need a sail, you just go downstream. And so predictable of that is the Egyptians use the same sign to mean going north generally, okay? Or if you want to go south, you got to put up the sail. Unfortunately, prevailing winds come from the north. And so you could put up that sail and you sail back upstream, or they use that as a general term also to signify going south. It's pretty cool. All right. Now, I've used the past tense to describe the Nile seasons and the hydrology in the Nile because modern technology has completely transformed them. The river no longer crests its banks. each June. It hasn't done so in 100 years. Today, the rising floodwaters are stockpiled onto a massive lake, Lake Nasser, created by the Aswan High Dam, completed in 1970 with extensive technical support from American civil engineers. The largest dam in the world at its time of construction, the dam was the last in a series of dams built in the Aswan area. The first begun in 1902, all of which were designed to increase Egypt's agricultural productivity. In this, the dam succeeded, but at incalculable environmental cost and transformation. Now, we might talk further about dams on the Nile and dire water politics of contemporary Egypt in the Q&A, but I'm going to stick to the ancient story for the rest of my time here. And I want to consider two other aspects of the ancient Nile, which we haven't gotten to yet, which is the Egyptians' dependence on boats, both real boats and boats they imagined up in the sky carrying the gods, or in the underworld carrying the gods. And we're going to talk about river animals, both real river animals and those which were more fanciful. Now, Egyptians have been boating on the Nile for thousands of years. Pre-dynastic pottery from around 4000 BC shows simple reed boats, much like the ones, the modern reconstruction you see here. And skiffs like this remained a popular form of boat transportation for poor Egyptians into the Roman period, as Pliny the Elder tells us. Elites, however, had access to larger wooden boats made without nails from acacia and sycamore trees. This model boat from the tomb of a Middle Kingdom official named Mekhethra shows several of the most common features of Egyptian wooden boats. We've got the curved hull, the single large steering wheel in the back, replacing an earlier design where they had two in the Old Kingdom, the collapsible mast, and a set of rowers as well, organized. This guy appears to be controlling the beat, so the rowers can move this ship across the Nile. Now, other Egyptian boats were utilitarian. From the Old Kingdom onwards, officials ordered the construction of barges that used the power of the river's flow to transport the massive blocks of granite and sandstone favored by Egyptian builders. From the Great Pyramids of Giza to the obelisk of Karnak, each weighing more than 350 tons, Egyptian architecture would not have been possible without the constant use of the river's kinetic energy. This point, obvious, yet still sometimes forgotten, has gained powerful support from a new study published of the Nile's geomorphology, published just last year, 2014. Using satellite photography and deep soil cores, a team of Egyptian, Australian, and American researchers have identified a major branch of the Nile that ran about 5 kilometers to the west, roughly, of the current bed. And if they are correct, this Akramat branch was a major branch, it would explain the location of many of the pyramids, all the way from Giza in the north, all the way down to Lisht in the south. And I'll be very curious, I don't feel like I have expertise in geomorphology to assess this new hypothesis, but it certainly seems to make sense. We'll have to see if it holds up under further inquiry. Now, while barges exemplify the pragmatic side of Egyptian river transport, there's also a key spiritual dimension. The Egyptians considered boats an indispensable tool for navigating the afterlife. The other world, or the Duat as they called it, was imagined as being composed of rivers, ponds, and marshes, packed with crocodiles and other dangerous creatures, especially the serpent Apophis. The dead required sturdy ships to traverse that world. And we know quite a lot about these funerary ships because many Old Kingdom pharaohs had them placed in their graves. The bark of Khufu, shown here, was excavated from a pit beside the Great Pyramid of Khufu in 1950. They knew it was there, but they didn't excavate it until they were ready. And the researchers believe that this boat originally carried the pharaoh's body across the Nile to the western shore for burial, and then was buried with him, beside him in the Great Pyramid. The gods likewise traveled by ship. The sun god Ra possessed a solar bark that carried him each evening across the other world, assisted by a panoply of gods who protected him during his hours of weakness. The ceiling of the Hathor temple at Dendera, begun in the late Ptolemaic period and completed under the Emperor Tiberius, shows the bark of Ra traveling across the starry heaven. You see the stars here representing. So the Egyptian notion was that when the sun god disappeared from the sky, he had to travel through another world. And sometimes it's thought of as sort of under the earth and sometimes across the heaven. But in either case, he's always traveling in a solar bark. In the words of the souls of pious Egyptians could assist the sun god on this journey. They could join the stars as oarsmen or crew on the solar bark. In the words of the pyramid and coffin text, these are what the words that you have to learn to say. You say, I am like the one, I am he who rose, I'm the one who doesn't get tired, working in the boat of Ra, or rowing the boat of the sun, the bark of the sun together with the stars. I am he who oversees the rigging of the god's bark. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is later than the coffin and pyramid text, includes numerous spells and utterances to be spoken by those who are seeking to travel by boat across the other world. Now, it was easy for Egyptians to imagine their gods as traveling by boat, so this is precisely how they observed them during festivals. Most Egyptian temples kept ceremonial boats in which the images of the gods traveled between their temples or while visiting the temples of other gods. During the festival of Opet, which is in the second month of the inundation, roughly in April. Wait, did I get that right? No, a second month of Shimu, in April, in the drought. Amun-Re, the chief deity of the 18th dynasty capital at Thebes, was carried on the shoulders of his priests to visit the nearby temple at Luxor. And during the festival of the Beautiful Valley, which was also during the harvest season, the god's boat shrine then crossed the Nile in a literal boat. So you've got the boat shrine crossing in a literal boat across to visit the gods on the other side at Del Bakri on the western bank. And not just any boat, the gods had to travel in style. Pharaohs regularly boast of the lavish adornment of the sacred barks of the gods, of the gold and electrum and ivory which were used to trim the boats made of fresh pine wood imported all the way from the Levant. The Egyptian zest for all types of boats, that is, boats which are vehicles that carried people, products, or gods on top of the water, contrasts sharply with their unease, their distrust of things that lay beneath the water, beneath the surface. And this brings me to my fourth and final section. Egyptian ideas about the species that lived in and around the Nile. And here too, we're dealing with a zone of interaction that has multiple utilitarian and symbolic dimensions. At a utilitarian level, the Egyptians depended upon the Nile's diverse fishes. Perch, catfish, carp, and other species are a major source of protein, especially because they didn't eat meat very much. Oxen were too important. They didn't have that many chickens either, some pig. Although fishing was considered a low-status profession, elites appreciated fishermen's expert knowledge of the tools of the trade: spears, nets, fish hooks. Paired scenes of fishing and fowling became one of the enduring formulas of Egyptian art. So all you need is a little bit of the scene you can recognize, because the iconography, the sort of standard imagery, it remains so constant over many centuries. The lavish tomb of the 6th dynasty vizier Khagimni, for instance, include this scene of lightly clad fishermen in reed skiffs scouting out anatomically precise fish, including 2 different types of catfish there on the far left and in the middle. At a symbolic level, fish were more problematic. This was partly because fish readily consumed any form of meat that fell in the water, including corpses. In a culture that placed great value on the preservation of the body, the river was viewed as the most contemptible of graves. No Egyptian wanted what we might call a green burial. No Egyptian wanted their corpse eaten up by fishes or critters. The Egyptian myth of the death and resurrection of the god king Osiris reinforced this anxiety. Murdered by his brother Seth, Osiris's dismembered corpse was tossed into the Nile. There it was recovered by his wife, sister, Isis, but not before the Oxyrhynchus fish had eaten his penis. This may be why Egyptian priests were not allowed to eat fish. The largest and most dangerous river creatures earned a place in Egyptian myth and ritual as well. The Nile crocodile is one of the largest reptiles on Earth, with documented cases in the modern period, 20-foot specimens weighing more than 2,000 pounds. For ancient Egyptians, the crocodile was, quote, the mouth of terror, the one who snatches. Middle Kingdom stories frequently feature crocodiles as agents of divine retribution, dragging adulterers and other ne'er-do-wells into the river. This does not mean, however, that the Egyptians always avoided crocodiles. Far from it. For the ancient Egyptians, the boundary between things to be feared and things to be revered was often thin, especially in their thinking about the animal world. As in Hinduism, the Egyptian animal world overlapped extensively with the realm of the gods. Temples in different regions of Egypt honored crocodiles as living manifestations of divine power. Some temples appear to have kept crocodiles in special wells or pools within the temple precinct. The keeping of live crocodiles, however, existed side by side with the pious burial of dead ones. And here the analogy of Hinduism falls short. At Kom Obo near Aswan and several sites in the Delta, priests oversaw the mummification of crocodiles. In doing so, they treated crocodiles much like they handled many other species, carefully desiccating and wrapping them up as dedications to the gods, a practice that extended across the entire 3,500-year span of pharaonic culture. Such dedications were especially common at sites sacred to Sobek, Egypt's crocodile-headed god, shown here in a Ptolemaic-era relief from Kom Obo. The god whom the Egyptians knew by a delightful array of intimidating epithets. Sobek was green of plume, wrathful of face, sharp of teeth, the great crocodile, the one who makes the two lands roar in fear, the lord of strife, the one who lives by robbing, and so forth. His character, though, was ambivalent, variously depicted as a protector, sometimes even assimilated to the sun god Ra, or as a force of chaos associated with Seth. Egyptians had a similarly complex view of another large river creature, the hippopotamus, even more dangerous. They didn't know it as a river horse, as our English word means. They called it a river pig. Now, male hippos were generally viewed as forces of destruction and evil. Perhaps the fact that hippos came out of the river at night and raided the adjacent fields contributed to their bad reputation. Old Kingdom tombs include multiple scenes of hippo hunting, in which the slaying of the hippo, usually with a whole team of retainers helping along with nets and spears, was considered a virtuous act against the powers of chaos. And this, again, is from the Mastaba Kagimni from the middle of the 24th century BC. Alongside these anti-hippo motifs, Egyptians developed another, very different strain of hippo imagery associated with hippo goddesses who were honored under a variety of names. The most popular of these hippo deities was Tawaret, who combined the features of a pregnant woman, a hippo, a crocodile, and a lion. Tawar amulets used for protection in childbirth remained in use in Egypt for more than 2,000 years. And I show you here a couple of examples from museum collections in New York and Boston. It's been my pleasure this evening to explore with you 4 different aspects of the history of ancient Egypt and the Nile. While it's well known that ancient Egyptian society depended on the unique qualities of this river, I've tried to show precisely how the river's seasonal rhythms underpinned Egyptian agrarian life and how these rhythms arose from the river's distinctive hydrology. We've also thought about how the Egyptians learned to use the river's power with various types of boats and barges, and investigated how those boats then contributed to the Nile's identity as a river of the gods, as boats for transporting the gods and their images. Now, understanding these features of the ancient Nile cannot solve the extremely serious problems faced by the residents roughly 500 million residents of the Nile River Basin today, where water is an increasingly and dangerously scarce commodity. But they can offer us perspective. They can offer us perspective by revealing the river's rich history over millennia in this important corner of northeastern Africa. And in my estimation, that fact makes this inquiry not only good for our brains, but also good for our souls. It helps us come to recognize that this ancient, dusky river is part of our shared human heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel, for a wonderful kaleidoscopic swashbuckling lecture through 3,500 years of history. It's not quite enough for me, so I'm going to ask you about what happens after. Namely, in the late 1st century BCE, Egypt becomes first a Roman client state and then a Roman province with a special administrative district in Alexandria. And for nearly 7 centuries thereafter, that flooding, that yearly inundation of the Nile, grew grain that was shipped across the Mediterranean to feed people not in Egypt, but far, far away. So my question is, how did the advent of Roman rule and colonial rule change local experiences of the Nile? And also, how did people far away from the Nile, who were fed by the Nile, feel about this river that they probably had never experienced?
Great. Thank you. It's my colleague, Mark Latney, Roman historian. Can you hear me still? Good. And are we going to take other questions by digital means or what? People raise their hands too. We can go low tech as well. So Mark's asked a good question. I may have planted it, but he articulated it. He articulated it much better than I ever would have. But I do have a slide. A couple of things. One, the fundamental fact is the hydrology doesn't change until the 20th century. So that means that the Romans abolished the priesthoods, but they didn't close the temples. And the old gods were still worshipped, and the hieroglyphics continued to be used, I think at least through the reign of Diocletian, maybe longer. So many of the patterns of, in relation to the agrarian rhythms of the Nile certainly continue under the Roman period, and in some of our best descriptions come from Roman writers, people you know better than me, like Pliny the Elder, and even scenes even show up in Greco-Roman novelists like Heliodorus that gives us our best description of the festival of the Nile. So we definitely use those sources of the Roman period to look back and try to understand earlier phases. There's some methodological challenges with that, but those Roman era sources are terribly important. And I come to this through later sources. I'm not an Egyptologist. I didn't want to say it at the front because I thought you might leave. We have, as far as I know, one person on campus who knows hieroglyphics. It's not me. But the Greek and Roman sources do give you an avenue in, and a really vital avenue. They're also, so what did they think of the Nile? There's this sculpture, famous sculpture there of the personification of the Nile, which is in the Vatican today. And he's, you know how many little guys or putti, these little fat angelic looking figures are on him? There's 16. Do you know why that's significant? How high does the Nile rise on good years? 16 cubits, right? So 16 becomes a well-known symbol of good luck, and it's incorporated here. So the Romans were very interested in the imagery of the Nile as a place of abundance. And so you certainly see it there. I think this sculpture is an example of that Roman fascination with the abundance of the Nile. I also include a picture of Isis. This is a more complicated example because the cult, this is a Greco-Roman version of the ancient cult of the Egyptian goddess Isis, but she becomes well-known and very popular all the way, across the Roman world. There's a great painting from Pompeii in this Greco-Roman form. And in this Greco-Roman form, she's frequently shown carrying a vase for pouring water. And I think this refers to this, this notion that the Nile water itself is holy and can be poured over a holy thing. And I think that's an echo of a much older ancient African belief in the sacrality of water. And you do have kind of African rituals, or ancient Egyptian rituals of pouring water over images of the gods. So I think that is one of the ways in which the kind of sacrality of the Nile is, transformed into something new. Yeah.
I'm gonna take my privilege to ask one more, and then we have some questions coming in digitally. So we'll ask those, and then we can do the raising hands thing. But the Romans were not the only newcomers. One of the earliest places that early Christians start popping up is in Egypt, especially in the Delta. And I can imagine that they had a very different relationship with the Nile as, let's say, the pagan Romans, as one would expect the followers of Muhammad who showed up in Egypt in the 640s. How does this story continue on as new religious movements arise and populate this valley?
Great. Again, the sort of fundamental rhythms of the Nile don't change with the change in government or religion into before the 20th century. But the explanations of those rhythms do change. So that both Christians and Muslims need to find new ways of explaining and celebrating the rise of the Nile. And as you say, the Christians are, actively antagonistic against the old gods and have to work very hard to denounce them, but in the process, sometimes absorb and some of those old stories. So you get stories of, they're still interested in crocodiles, but now they're saints who ride on the back of crocodiles and control crocodiles. They still celebrate the rise of the Nile, but they believe the Nile rises now because of the blood of the martyrs, right? And you get that, and I don't know as much about the Muslim period. I don't even know the Coptic material well. Mark would probably know it better, but I do know there is one story in the medieval period where the Fatimid Caliph writes a letter to the Nile, and he's addressing Nile like, why the Nile? He's like, I know you don't rise anymore because we don't sacrifice virgins anymore, because that's what they used to do, some sort of distant pagan past. It's complete fantasy, right? But I think in Islamic terms as well, sometimes the old rhythms survive, but sort of transmuted into an Islamic form. And I think in my original description recommendations, I recommended a film called For Those Who Sail to Heaven. And that film is a documentary about the festival of Sidi El Abu Hajjaj, who's a Sufi saint whose shrine is built into the temple at Karnak. It's like built on top of the temple. It first shows up in like the 11th century. And the festival of Abu Hajjaj still has processions of boats. And you've got to always be a little bit careful about being too romantic and ancient survivals. But I think sometimes there are genuinely things that come from deepest antiquity that get absorbed then into Christian and Muslim tradition and practiced in a slightly new form. Doesn't mean they're not Muslim. It means they're using parts of that inherited past in a new way. So. I highly recommend the documentary if you have a chance.
So we have a number of questions coming in. I'm going to just go with the first one because it's something that I think you are interested in talking about, which is how has the damming of the Nile changed the sort of the social dynamics around the way people relate to the Nile, and also has there been any outrage or blowback, especially with the loss of cultural heritage?
Wow. I actually can't answer those questions because I'm not a modern Egyptian historian. I don't know if Chris Townsel's here or Lynn Thomas who's here. And Lynn's here. I don't know if Lynn has an answer to that. That's a difficult question that really would involve knowing the rhythms of contemporary Egypt. I guess what I've looked at more is the way in which modern history, as an ancient historian, some of modern history is a real bummer, right? Because it's just the reality now is that there are 500 million people living in the Nile River basin, and there's not enough water. Egypt depends on its water, the Nile, for like 95% of its water. It just doesn't rain in Egypt. That's why the material is preserved so well. That's why I could show you things with rope that's 2,000 years old. And now with the development of countries upstream, there was a colonial water sharing agreement made around 1910 that really favored Egypt and Sudan. And now Uganda, Ethiopia want to make a greater claim on their portions of the Nile. And the Egyptians are already running out of water because of the vast population growth in Egypt. So they went from 100 years ago having, you're supposed to have at least 1,000 cubic liters per person, and they're well below that now. So you can just see the chart of it going down. And now with Ethiopia and Uganda claiming more of the river for themselves, especially the dam building projects in Ethiopia, I don't see how you're going to avoid war, frankly. That's what I think there's going to be eventually.
This is a thing that Joel does. He says, I don't know, somebody else knows the answer, and then he has a brilliant answer. This one should be a little bit more in your wheelhouse, though, which is 2 questions about some of the material evidence that you brought up. There was a number of pregnant statues, some questions about why there are so many pregnant statues, and another question about there seems to be a lot of evidence for people working together, right? Especially on ships. Is there any sort of ideological resonance there? Why are there so many statues of people rowing together?
Wow, those are really interesting questions. I would first of all say, I'd say a lot of ancient cultures are maybe more comfortable with images of fertility, of the pregnant female body than, pregnant fertility marked in the changes of the female body during pregnancy. A lot of ancient cultures are much more comfortable with those images as signs generally of abundance and fertility, right? They don't hide them, they celebrate them. With the amulets I showed you at the end, they are strange figures as well, right? They're hybrid animal-human, like she's hippo. She's not just a pregnant hippo though, right? It's a hippo, woman, crocodile, lion. So it's something about, and the Greeks and Romans always thought this was the weirdest part about ancient Egypt. They always made fun of them. They're like, they're animal-headed gods. But as I say, it's because of a very different conception of what the animal world is, seeing the animal world as somehow connected to the divine world in a way that, for me, echoes what you see in Hinduism. There's a sort of similar connection between animal and divinity. Not exactly the same, but analogous in some respects. I don't know. I don't know if I have a better answer than that. Why do people work together? Are they shown working together? That is really interesting. I think it's because much of that evidence comes from Old Kingdom tombs and then tomb figurines. And what are tomb figurines? They are it's putting everything you need with you to go into the next life, right? It goes back to already in the pre-dynastic period where they buried, hundreds of jugs of beer and, lots of cuts of meat to take into the next life with you. So you also want to take people who are producers, right? Images, and they stop human sacrifice very early. And there's some evidence of human sacrifice around 3500 BC or something, or 3200 BC. That dies out, but instead you get the burial of representatives and people who will work for you. And they can work for you on a boat, they can work for you plowing a field, they can work fishing for you. And what those images, both carved on the walls of tombs and depicted in figurines placed in tombs, they give us is this window into the social history of the non-elites that we don't hear about in the sources, in the written sources very much. So they're invaluable. So I don't think I fully answered the question, but I tried.
We'll have time for just a couple more. Were there people in Egyptian society who lived in the Red Land, in the desert? And if so, why did they live there?
The Red Land is never empty, even if Egyptian scribes living in the Black Land want you to think it is, right? That is, the Red Land is the land beyond the control of the tax collector. So there are people living out in the Red Land, but they're not very large numbers of them because they don't have farming to support them. And there are oases out there, and the Egyptians do tend to colonize those oases and use them. But the intermittent spaces are the land of the nomads, of camel herders and others who have a very low reputation in the written sources. But it's really not until the period of late antiquity that you're so familiar with that when the monks go out to the desert, they encounter, right? They go out to the tombs and beyond the tombs because they're trying to escape the village. And they have a series of encounters, and there are lots of stories about sort of interactions between monks and nomads. So it's a great question. The Deshret is not empty. The scribes just want you to think it's empty, think it's the land of.
Okay, we have time for 1.5 more. The half is Deshret etymologically related to desert, or is this a false friend?
I don't know.
Great. Okay, next question, last question.
What do you think? What do you guess? False? No.
I think it's probably a false friend.
It's probably false.
I don't know. We'll find out and email everybody. Okay, last question. Is there a difference in the way that people think about and relate to the Nile between the valley and the delta?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, so the delta and the Fayum, the nearby region of the Fayum, account for at least a third of the agrarian land. I mean, it's really big, and it's some of the most fertile land of all. So the delta is definitely part of the Egyptian Nile the Nile ecosystem as a whole, but you are very close to the Mediterranean, and so that means that you are closer to potential influences and contacts. And obviously, with the foundation of Alexandria, in the Hellenistic period, those contacts with the Mediterranean expand tremendously. But even much earlier, even at the time of, say, before the foundation of the New Kingdom, when you have a period of the rule of the Hyksos, right, who are the Egyptians, after the New Kingdom is found, they blamed the Hyksos as bad foreigners. But all it was is they were people coming in from essentially the Levant, who then adopted elements of Egyptian civilization, but also elements of Mediterranean, even Minoan, influence. So I think the delta, on the one hand, I'm saying it's definitely part of the same ecological world that we're talking about here in the Nile Valley, but as you approach the Mediterranean, you do have that potential for new forms of contact and ultimately influence, transformative in the case of Alexandria. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Professor Walker.